Jocelyn was only 6 years old when the man in orange tried to break through her window. Had it not been for her older brother Julian, I may be telling you a much different story. It occurred on the night of August 13th, a humid summer night filled with the sounds of crickets and tree frogs. The window AC unit hummed away in the living room. Unfortunately, the cold air did not make its way to the opposite side of the one-story Florida home. Jocelyn and Julian would sleep with box fans blowing wildly those nights, but they barely kept the sweat from rising on their skin as the humid nights of summer continued with no reprieve. Behind their expansive backyard, the coarse St. Augustine grass led its way to an easement separating an orange grove and the community they lived in. Beyond this was something different. Something everyone in the suburban community was aware of, but didn't mention. It wasn't a haunted house or some location where someone was murdered. It was the prison. The prison housed several hundred inmates at a time. Many were held there in between sentencing and future court dates. The locals, for many years, believed it better to not talk about the prison. Edna Shields, a neighbor, was quoted when asked about the prison. "We all believed it was better to not discuss it. Better to be locked up in the county broom closet than make a fuss over. Even small prisons have a way of preventing people from coming through, even if it's just for visiting friends or family." Edna did have a solid argument. Local prisons carry a stigma for the areas that surround them. Some people are terrified of even being close to a prison, while others say it's the safest place to be. It was the late comedian George Carlin who more or less said, well, if someone was to escape from prison, the last place they'd hang around was anywhere near it. Jocelyn at the time was only 6. She was unaware of the prison. After all, what would be the purpose of getting a little girl upset about something that would never happen? Famous last words. Several months prior, Joseph Gilmanson was arrested for the murder of his wife and 3 children. The Gilmanson children were only 14, 9, and 2 at the time. The 2 oldest, Erica, 14, and Joseph Jr., 9, were suffocated with a pillow. Afterwards, they were each shot in the head, while the pillow was still placed on their faces. Detectives on the scene declared it is not uncommon for a murderer to perform this kind of act. In a crime of passion, or as in this case, the murder of your own family, this final move eliminates any possibility of the person suddenly waking if the victim was not yet deceased. The youngest, Bethany, was the first of the family to go. Sadly, she was found in her crib with her tiny throat slit open. Slight bruises found on her cheeks. The bruising was thought to be from Joseph's hands in an attempt to cover her cries from being overheard by the other family members. Alice, or Allie Gilmanson, was located in the family's basement, hung by a rope attached to the joists in the ceiling. Her left and right ankle were both broken. The left was broken several hours later, according to the coroner. Apparently, Gilmanson let his wife hang there in agony, attempting to hold herself up with her broken ankles, ultimately succumbing to the rope that suffocated her once she could no longer hold her own body's weight on her busted legs. Joseph Gilmanson was found in the town of Millville, approximately 25 miles away from the family home. A patron of DeMott's Pub found Gilmanson laying naked in one of the bathroom stalls. Percy Chismar, the man who found him, was quoted in a follow-up interview about finding Gilmanson.
"He was covered in blood. His hands were clenched in fists so tight they looked like the bone was trying to break through at the knuckles. I'll never forget the face that turned and saw me. No, sir, not for as long as I live. The man's face was gray, like all the blood and color was sucked away. His hair was also full of something wet and sticky, blood as well, I suppose. His eyes, though, they would stand out the most. They looked at me, pupils so wide they almost looked black, like a demon's. They were sunk deep into his cheeks. Dark circles below made it look like that mascara stuff women use to pretty themselves up. It was all smeared all over. But no, it was his eyes. It was his skin. And he said only 2 words, killed and family. Now, I had not an idea what that meant, but it didn't sound good. So I ran out the bathroom as quick as I could, slammed a bar stool up against the knob, so he couldn't get out. Then I yelled over to Gus and Roger to help hold the door shut and call Sheriff Womack.
Since then, Joseph Gilmanson has been through several prison cells. Numerous attempts on his life inside caused more and more delays. The entire time he claimed it was not him. Although he was found with his entire family's DNA stuck to his body after further lab results. The evidence was there, and it had been there the entire time, but Gilmanson swore he could never kill his family. He claimed there was something else, something evil and malevolent, that has followed him in the shadows his entire life. Of course, there wasn't a single person, including the jury or the judge, that believed a word of it. Nobody in their right mind, no matter how biased, was willing to believe a man who brutally murdered his family was followed by a curse or some kind of monster that killed the man's family. Several years after the incident, a jury member who requested to remain anonymous said, "The only monster in that courtroom was Joseph Gilmanson. He was evil, a liar, and a murderer. He was not the loving family man his attorney tried to make him appear." Problems began, however, when many began to worry that Gilmanson's defense would possibly make a strong case for insanity so that he could prevent the death penalty. In an attempt to prevent this from happening, further court dates were pushed back for several months during an ongoing and elaborate mental evaluation. And it was during that time attempts were made on Gilmanson's life, only prolonging his sentencing and trial further and further away. Gilmanson, who was now awaiting sentencing the following week, escaped on August 13th, 1985. Earlier that afternoon, Jocelyn and Julian found a wounded lizard in their backyard. It's well known that small lizards in Florida will not only lose their tails to get away from a predator, but also will grow back a new one as time goes on. And Julian had seen his share of lizards with their missing appendage. However, this one had been trying to hobble away off the patio, but its wounded hind legs prevented it from running off to safety. The brother and sister scooped it up and kept it in a tiny glass aquarium that had been home to Jocelyn's goldfish. Goldie lasted only about 2 weeks before receiving the royal flush down the toilet. The aquarium had sat lonely in the corner of the garage, collecting dust by the rear window since then. "I hate to say it, guys, but he may be better outside with his friends than inside with us," Suzanne Coughlin said to her 2 small children. But we can try to help him. His leg is broken, I think. He'll die out there if we don't help him." It only took a few sweet tears of her 6-year-old to change her mind and allow the children to nurse the small lizard back to help. "Okay, you can try to help them, but do not take him out. He stays in there at all times. Is that clear?" "Clear, Mom. Thanks. Come on, Joss. Let's see if we can find some crickets for him to eat." The kids ran back outside, finding sticks and debris to make a small home for him inside the aquarium. Suzanne observed her children from the kitchen window in delight, everyone unaware that just a few miles away, Joseph Gilmanson was squeezing and contorting his way to his eventual escape. That night, Jocelyn and Julian Coughlin, who previously, and with much satisfaction to Suzanne, had been so happy and friendly, but that began to waver. "But I found him, Joss. It's my responsibility. No, it's my tank. He's going to sleep in my room." After several minutes of the two children arguing, Suzanne cut in. It was ultimately decided that Jocelyn would sleep with the lizard in her room that night, covered and sealed, I should add. Julian would have been able to keep it in his room the following night. This ultimately was the decision that changed the course of their lives that night. Under the moon and stars, Joseph Gilmanson wandered aimlessly. Only the faint lights in the distance guided him through the acres of orange trees. Only two thoughts continued to swell in the mind of Gilmanson. Where do I go, and where can I hide? He trudged through the fields of trees, ducking every once in a while, thinking he saw movements or detected dogs barking. He assumed it was his own paranoia after several times dodging behind a tree, holding his breath to listen. Each time the only sounds were the same crickets and tree frogs sounding their nightly chorus. He cursed and continued his silent march to the lights glowing several hundred yards from where he stood. As Gilmanson approached the dirt path that was used to travel to and from the orange grove, he hesitated. He was sure that as soon as he stood to jog across the path, dozens of spotlights and guards would be waiting to seize him, bringing him back to the prison. Laying prone in the weeds at the edge of the grove, he stayed, the damn crickets like nails on a chalkboard in his ears. Finally, he pushed himself on one knee. His weight made it settle into the damp grass below him, and he sensed the coolness on his knee through the thin orange jumpsuit. No lights, no dogs barking, and he soon began to believe he had been successful in his escape. He rose to his feet and began to jog across the path. He had spotted a large bunch of scrubby shrubs on the opposite side. That was where he would run and dip behind before his next move. A moment later, he was hidden. Shadows of the trees above him, shielded by the shrubs, he laid there still and silent. A moment later, as he laid on his back, he glanced over to his right, surveying the several houses from the edges of their backyards. Most had lights on still. Some had the faint silver-blue glow of a TV through thin curtains. The house furthest down, the one with the swing set, had the least amount of lights. This would be the house he would use to hide. He'd steal the car and do what he would need to do to get away, and he hoped it would be that easy, hoped he would experience little to no issues. All he acknowledged at this point was that he wasn't going back, no matter what the cost. Gilmanson approached the swing set. It was located in the far back corner. He stood 20 or so feet from it. He looked carefully at the house. He scanned each window until he spotted a single window that from his vantage point appeared to be open. Appearing in the window, a square box about the size of a toaster oven was perched in the left corner. Behind that, the room appeared dark. Inside the room, little Jocelyn Coughlin lay in her bed sleeping soundly. Spots, as she called her newly attained but injured pet, lay above her in the small aquarium. Julian had suggested she put the lizard on her windowsill so he could see the outside. Julian said it would probably make Spots feel more like he was safe at home. Jocelyn agreed, and the two of them spent a good half hour getting the aquarium set up just right on the sill. The aquarium had a base that was several inches wider than her windowsill. This concerned Julian. All he could imagine in his young mind was the teetering aquarium tipping over and crashing down on his sister's bed. Of course, Spots would either be hurt more or will have run away and they would never see him again. His other concern was for the tank to land on his sister and hurt her. But he was more concerned about the already wounded lizard. The only way for them to prop the aquarium on the sill correctly was to open Jocelyn's window and screen. This is what would allow them to slide the thin board they found in the garage on the sill. This would be broad enough now to fit the base of the aquarium securely. On most nights, the window was closed, and although the AC unit in the living room didn't supply enough cold air to the bedrooms situated in the rear of the house, if the children slept with a fan and their bedroom door open, enough cool air would wind its way to their side of the house. This is what kept them comfortable enough during the sweltering Florida summer nights. But tonight, little Jocelyn lay in her bed with her window slightly cracked open and her bedroom door shut. As Gilmanson approached the window quietly from the backyard of the Coughlin home, Julian stirred again in his bedroom across the hall. Every time Julian would begin to welcome the warm, familiar hands of sleep, his mind would suddenly switch to the lizard in his sister's bedroom. Eventually, he had had enough with all the worrying. He grabbed the pillow from his bed and his sleeping bag from the closet. He decided he would be able to sleep if he camped out on the floor of Jocelyn's bedroom. This would also allow him to monitor how Spots was doing. As soon as he entered her bedroom door, he knew something was wrong. Jocelyn was sound asleep, laying on her side. The moonlight shined brightly through her window. The aquarium was no longer there. Instead, there was the silhouette of a man climbing through, reaching his hands towards the sleeping girl.
"Mommy, help!"
he screamed, while at the same time grabbing his sister's arm, pulling her off the bed before the man's hands could grab her. He was successful. Jocelyn fell to the ground with a loud thud. Julian then pulled her through the doorway, slamming it behind him. Suzanne came running down the hall, frantic and still foggy from sleep. What's wrong, Jules? What's wrong? There's... He couldn't get the words out. Suzanne prodded. There's what? Calm down. What's there? A man coming in her window. Suzanne's tension released, believing it was only a nightmare. And just as soon as she was about to say something, she heard a loud noise from behind Jocelyn's door. She took Julian by the shoulder, placing him behind her, as she apprehensively opened the door. Crouched on Jocelyn's bed, across the room, was Joseph Gilmanson. He had now made it through the window, but was struggling to gain his balance on the springy mattress and stuffed animals strewn on the bed. Suzanne slammed the door shut with a loud scream. Frantically, she ran thousands of ideas in her mind, some of how she would be able to escape the situation, but most were of being kidnapped or even worse, murdered by the mysterious and uninvited guest that had just broken in through her daughter's window. Luck had surely been on their side that night, as only a few days before Suzanne had decided to repaint her bedroom. Located outside her bedroom were several gallon containers of paint, which was the only weapon she could think in her haste to use. But more importantly, her bedroom phone was laying on the floor in the hallway they stood in. Suzanne quickly realized she couldn't let go of the door handle. Although she was sure the maniac on the other side would easily be able to open the door with a few quick twists of the handle, she would not let go. "Don't you come through this door," she shouted. "I have a gun and I will blow a hole through you as big as that window you climbed in, you sick son of a bitch." Julian stared at his mother, partly in shock, mostly confused, because all she had were the two hands fiercely tightened around the doorknob. "Julian," she muttered, nodding to the phone. "Call the police. Call them now. Tell them we have someone breaking into our house. Give them the address. Hurry. Go now." Julian scrambled to the phone. The phone number for the local police station was written down on the phone's keypad. Several numbers were there, but the number for the police was the boldest, as Suzanne used a marker for that number. In the case of, but never wished upon, emergencies. "You don't have to do that, ma'am," a voice yelled from the other side of the door. Gilmanson's voice. "Just give me your car and I'll leave. Simple as that. You hear me?" "Don't you take another step towards this door. I swear to God I will shoot you dead. Why do you want my car?" Suzanne didn't care less what his answer was, just as long as she could hear his voice. This would allow her to know he was still in the room and not trying to escape out the window. She waited until he responded. Julian was still on the phone with dispatch, but she couldn't have them wait any longer. She whispered again, "Julian, take Joss and run across to Miss Hatfield's house. Hurry. Tell her what's happening. Go now." Jocelyn began to cry, not fully understanding if this was real life or a bad dream. She felt her brother's hand grab hers as her feet began to run below her. To young Jocelyn, it seemed like she was a different person. One following her brother to the front door, the other part of her still stuck in the moment, watching it all unfold before her. Gilmanson stood in the room, contemplating his next move. Should he just scramble out the window and take cover, or should he muscle his way through the young mother and her kids? He supposed she didn't have a husband or boyfriend in the house, or he would have heard a man's voice. He decided to take his chances with the young mother. He stood in the middle of the room. He didn't take any steps. He waited to see what he could hear through the door. All he caught were some inaudible whispers. "I don't want to hurt no one. I just want your car. That's all." The children rushed to the door, opened it, and began running through the front yard. She prayed they would get there unharmed. Of course it was a risk, but either way, she played the scenario through her mind. She knew they had a better chance by leaving the house instead of being inside it. "If I give you my car, how do I know you're going to leave us alone?" Again, she didn't care about his response. She simply wanted to know if he was still in the bedroom. "I'll give you my word." "I don't believe you." Furious now, Joseph approached the door, slamming his palms on it. "Give me your fucking car, lady. You have to the count of 10 to let me have it. 10! Gilmanson began to count down. Raging tears began filling her eyes. All she wanted was to make sure the kids were okay, that they were safe. "I need to keep him talking," she thought. Gilmanson continued counting. She knew any moment he'd begin pulling on that knob, and she wouldn't be able to hold it all night. The knob already slippery in her sweaty hands. She understood she had only one move if he did get the door open. She hoped that move would be enough. 1. I'm coming through now. He grabbed the knob, and with a few hard jerks, it turned all the way. He gradually began to open the door. He was still unsure, but confident enough that the woman on the other side did not, in fact, have a gun. Suzanne had let go of the doorknob. She backed up to the wall, hitting the light switch, shutting them all off in the hallway. The knob began turning more and more as her adrenaline began coursing through her veins. She recognized the familiar creak of the door begin to peel itself from the paint that would stick in the warm Florida humidity. That was the sound she waited for. Without missing a beat, she ran at the door with all of her might. She hoped it would allow her enough force to stun him. As Gilmanson continued to open the door, he began to cock his head to take a glance into the hallway. Just as he was about to get a look, the door blasted him in the bridge of the nose. Everything went white for a split second. The pain was instant. The taste of blood was just as fast. He stumbled backwards as the force of the door brought him down on his ass. His head hit the bookcase behind him. He shook the pain from his throbbing face, only to be clobbered on the top of his skull by a silver paint can. The warm sensation of blood from his split skull began to pour down his forehead, his eyebrows trickling into his eyes. The doorway ahead of him was blurry and spinning. The woman screamed, and he heard her footsteps hastily running down the hallway. Gilmanson lay there, dazed. The faint sound of sirens could be detected in the distance. He couldn't tell if he was imagining the sirens or if they were real. He also was just beginning to grasp he got his ass kicked by a young mother protecting her children. The sirens began to increase in volume. This caused him to become more aware. He had to get out. Flee for the second time that day. Not only had the dumb bitch called the police, but he was sure that by now the prison was already aware of his escape and everyone was out looking for him. He approached the window, this time to escape out of it. He was angry with himself. He was so close to freedom he could almost taste it, but now the weight of getting caught again was explicit. He began climbing through the window. The sirens were very close now, within 100 yards or so. As his feet landed on the ground below, he heard the shrieks of several car tires screech in the front of the house. Through the backyard, he could see more flashing blue and red lights approaching the path he ran across only a short time ago. His only chance was to run to the side of the house and duck into the next-door neighbor's yard. It was a dangerous move, but one that must be taken. As he crept his way over to the side of the house, he peered his head around the corner. It was clear. It's now or never, he thought. He counted to 3 and began sprinting across the yard. In the dark, he did not make out the chicken wire fence that surrounded the neighbor's vegetable garden. Gilmanson tripped, falling hard. He tried to stand, but his feet and ankles were caught in the fence. "Put your hands on your head and don't make a move. You're surrounded."
He's over here! He's over here!
The officer yelled. Gilmanson knew he was fucked. He began thrashing his legs, attempting to get loose of the chicken wire. "Stay still and stay down," the voice yelled. He looked at the officer, his gun trained on Gilmanson's chest. "I ain't going back. You can kill me, but I ain't going back." Gilmanson began to stand. The officer began shouting, then another. Several officers surrounded him. Their flashlights began blinding him. Gilmanson raised his hands to block the light. An officer on the scene, who had only been on the force for 2 months, began to fire his weapon. On that officer's official paperwork, he noted that he thought the perpetrator had raised a weapon. That's why he fired. Gilmanson felt the first bullet buzz past his right ear, a second by his left. The third hit him in the shoulder. Several other rounds sounded in multiple directions. Shots rained down on him. Sharp, pounding sensations began hitting his body. The noise of bullets missing their mark, hitting the dirt with a dull thud, eerily sounded the same to Joseph as the bullets entering his flesh. As Gilmanson lay on the ground, everything moving in slow motion, he saw the silhouettes of a family watching it all from across the street. A shadow of a teenage girl and her younger brother. A thin woman in a nightgown held a small child in her arms, their heads all tilted to the side, watching him as the bullets continued to riddle his body. Each bullet that entered him pulled the vision of the silhouettes closer to him, until they were only a few feet in front of him. It was them. It was his family. They were all there, watching this happen to him. Their faces were dark, shadowed, but he identified it was them. And suddenly, as the shooting ceased, Gilmanson gazed up at his wife one final time. He saw the glowing edge of a rope noose still around her neck. Tears filled his eyes on his final few breaths. As his face sunk into the earth below him, he examined her ankles. They were twisted and cracked, not touching the ground. In fact, all of them hovered only inches off of it. As his life began to drain away, he saw the spirits of his family drift away like smoke in a starless sky. Behind them, only now visible to him, the dark entity that had followed him his entire life stood watching. Through the darkness, the malevolent being observed through its lifeless eyes of black. It waved to the dying man as it stepped back, disappearing into the darkness forever. Gilmanson let out one last dying breath. I told you, it wasn't me.